Alrighty, folks. So, what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be going over the honorable mentions for Merry Huntmas 2023, that being the top 12 flagships in Monster Hunter. By this point, you can probably guess who number one is going to be. We're going to cover the honorable mentions now. So what I'm going to be doing is making this unscripted video. We're going to go just down the list from the mainline games into the non-mainline games. We're going to talk about the monsters who didn't make the top 12 and why. Why myself and my friends didn't include some of these guys. And as I said, there's probably a good chunk of these that feasibly could have been on the list, but just weren't as good as 12 others, or 13 technically, because we had a tie on the list this year. So we're just going to go down the line. We're going to talk about them. So first one is going to be Azure Rathalos of Monster Hunter G, that being the third of the first generation Monster Hunter games. So I talked a lot about the prevailing legacies of some of these flagship monsters in the list this year, and because that was kind of the big thing about them, is like what they've been able to do for Monster Hunter. And there is a compelling argument to make, now that I think about it, with Azure, of like the whole concept of monster flagship or monster variations as a whole, which is, especially nowadays, a big aspect of monster design, especially as they've gotten so good over time. So if he was on this list, that's probably what I would have harped on the most, because that's a huge contribution. A couple things working against that, though. The first one being is Azure himself is definitely not a particularly well-liked monster. And neither is Kashala, but I'll kind of go into my justification a little bit more. So Azure Rathalos kind of had not the best fights across the board. He is the Rathalos who's generally regarded as the one who accentuates the worst aspect of Rathalos, that being prolonged in-flight combat. And with Azure not being in Rise and Sunbreak, he has yet to benefit from the improved flying combat that Rathalos got in that game. So Azure's last version that we've had of him in World and Iceborne was not generally well liked, probably one of the bottom rung monsters in that game in terms of popularity, in terms of fun factor to fight. His design got a massive downgrade, and he, in a game that had a lot of really good variations, he still is one who seems to not have found his differentiation, his reason to be on a roster yet. Whereas, you have the Metal Wraths in that game, which totally overhauled how they worked in comparison to their fourth and third and second and first generation versions. Azure comes in Monster Hunter G, and if I'm not mistaken, G is the game that introduces the whole concept of the monster variation. And as I said, big deal. The only issue there is that monster variations took a little while to really kind of earn their keep. In that first game in Monster Hunter G, a lot of the first generation subspecies that are out there are really kind of just palette swaps. They don't behave all that different. They don't act all that different. They really don't have any different elements. They might frequent a different map more often than their original incarnation, but that's kind of the best you get. Second generation is a little bit better. The monsters start to behave a little bit differently, might do something vaguely differently. Third generation gets a little bit better. I'd say it wasn't really until the fourth generation, until 4 shows up, that monster subspecies and variations, being these heavily modified versions of their original incarnations, and really kind of justifying themselves being on the roster and really just behaving differently and having different animations and different attacks and different behaviors and different ecology. I think it took a couple of years for this category to really earn its keep across the board. They gradually got better. A third generation has some really good ones, but I'd say it took a good long while for Azure Rathalos' legacy as like the head of the monster variations to really kind of cement itself as a trend that really deserved to be in Monster Hunter. So the prolongment of his legacy really kind of hinders him more than, say, a Kushala Daora, who is another monster that is not beloved in every incarnation, had kind of a messy fight in World and Iceborne, came from a game who that didn't come to the West. You know, Dose and G both didn't. But Kushala's legacy is much more quick acting, much more immediately effective, and Kushala also benefits from being in Rise and Sunbreak and having a massive overhaul and doing extremely well. So that's what bumps Kushala onto this list, and what keeps Azure off of it. We didn't even really consider the variation angle when we made this list initially, but thinking about it now, that would be his justification, and it's a legitimate justification. I think Azure probably deserves a little bit more credit than we originally gave him when we made this list. We wrote him off pretty easily, just because his World and Iceborne version is pretty bad, and because we have no connection to the game he came from, because it never came stateside. But I think Azure does deserve some flowers that he doesn't get as typically. So yeah, Azure Rathalos, decent legacy, took a little bit to kick in. I hope he comes back with a better version. I'd love to see a 6th generation Azure and give him his green wings back. So going down the list, we have all the 2nd generation flagships on the list. We have all the 3rd generation ones on the list. Gore's on the list. So we come to Seregios. And it hurts a little bit that Seregios isn't on the list, but I was the one who advocated for him not being on there, and I think the reason for that is very valid. That being, his game gets taken over completely. Gore and Shagaru are the reason why 4 Ultimate's plot happens. Seregios is only a problem because of the Frenzy virus, because it creates an Apex Seregios, and the Apex monsters becomes the end game of 4 Ultimate. So Seregios' game is entirely co-opted by Gore. That doesn't make Seregios bad. He's got a couple of really good fight scenes. Yeah, he's given some pretty decent menace. He's built up to be this big rival monster for the rats. He's seen able to take down Rathian. He's seen able to square up with an Azure Rathalos. They do build up that he himself is a dangerous monster. I'd say he does legitimately have some cool presence within 4 Ultimate, but his whole reason for being there is because Gore took over that entire game. Gore was 4 and 4 Ultimate. He's even on the Western box. Gore Magala's even on the Western box art for Ultimate. Seregios isn't on the box art, and that's really just kind of what takes that away from him. That and Seregios pioneers Bleed, and Bleed is kind of cool. Bleed is a status ailment that has not stuck particularly well. It's generally seen as a minor nuisance. It's got a little bit of menace in Sunbreak, where it increases the damage that you can take, and it does chip damage over time. It's very easy to get rid of. It's not on a lot of monsters. They took it off of Nargacuga in Sunbreak. I don't know why they did that. Yeah, it's a status ailment that never really stuck. Unlike Blast, it never found its way onto weapons. Unlike Frenzy, it never made its way onto an armor skill. He does have some cool stuff with his gear, though, with the roll to evade or the roll to sharpen that he used to have on his weapons, but that just got turned into blade scale hone in Sunbreak, which, blade scale hone is cool, but that kind of takes away some uniqueness from him long term. So he really doesn't have too much of a strong prevailing legacy. His unique passive ability on his weapon got taken away. That got just turned into a regular armor skill that you can put on anything. Bleed never made it onto weapons. Bleed hasn't stuck very well. It made its way into Frontier, which is kind of cool. Seregios made his way into Frontier, which is kind of cool. He's a really good design. He's a good fight. I think he's probably got some of the coolest flying wyvern attacks out there, just especially in Rise and Sunbreak. I think what they were able to do with him combat wise in that game is super duper cool. His fight is properly challenging. He does a lot of damage. He's really, really fast. There's a good amount of spectacle to him when you fight him, because you just have these big, like, wrap-around flying sweep attacks. He's super nimble, super agile, and excellent flyer. I think in terms of, like, what they're able to do with the flying wyvern body type, I think he's got one of the coolest fights there is. But yeah, no, he's a really good addition to the flying wyverns, but in terms of being a flagship, little prevailing gameplay legacy, completely overshadowed role in his own game. As a flagship, he definitely gets wounded a lot. It's very similar logic to what wounds Brachydios, but the thing about Brachydios is that Slime and Blast have had a huge legacy in Monster Hunter. So that's why Brachy remains on the list, but Seregios doesn't. So cutting over to the rest of the Fated Four, we have Aztalos, Gammoth, and Mizu. I'll talk about Gammoth first. Gammoth was the first one to be knocked off of the list from the Fated Four. One of the earliest monsters we knocked off the list when we were making the top 12, which you'll see in the Patreon video if you want to check that out. So Gammoth's situation is unfortunate. I like Gammoth. I really want to love Gammoth. I think a lot of people kind of do. Her being a gigantic, hefty quadruped has definitely hurt her a little bit. It makes her fight a tad uninteresting, and it has made it so that she probably wasn't going to fit in a lot of the 5th generation maps because of the narrow passageways in between a lot of the zones. Would have been tough to get her into some of that stuff. I'm hoping that she comes back and gets a little bit of a touch up. Her frame and skeleton and model definitely makes it a little bit difficult to make a particularly engaging fight. I've been fighting her a couple of times in Generations again, because I picked that game back up. And her fight is better than I remembered it being. It's much more engaging than I remembered it being, which is good. I think she's generally regarded to be the boringest one, and I think that's technically true, but I think it's perhaps a little bit overstated. I think they are able to get some good stuff out of Gammoth, but I think has probably some untapped potential, and the guys who make these games are geniuses, so I imagine that eventually they'll be able to figure out how to make her work. But her being the only Fated 4 member to not be in the 5th generation hurts her. Her having probably the weakest fight of the Fated 4 hurts her. Very, very cool monster conceptually, hasn't lived up to that yet. All right, so Aztalos. I fought for Aztalos and I fought for Mizu. Unfortunately, I did have to concede. Aztalos is a personal favorite of mine. The theme, the design, the colors, the fight. Talking about like Seregios bringing a lot to the table for Flying Wyvern combat. Aztalos is right up there with him as a monster who fights like no other Flying Wyvern can. Really kind of pushed how the model can work. Using his wings as his primary weapon, more or less, is something that none of the others really do, and I really appreciate that. Shown up in Sunbreak, really, really cool. Had a great fight in Sunbreak. Legacy-wise, he doesn't really bring much of anything to the table. That's kind of the whole thing. He's very unique in of himself, but nothing's really come out of him. The Fated Four suffer from having very, very limited story and lore presence. I think Gammoth and Aztalos especially. Super duper good monster. Love this guy. Was not going to make the list. Mizutsune, I fought for. I fought for him over Kushaladora. Eventually, I did concede, because Kushaladora did deserve to be on the list, and like Volstrax and Glavenus were also up for contention on the bottom rungs of the top 12, and ultimately Mizutsune wasn't going to beat out Glavenus and wasn't going to beat out Volstrax, and although I think he's definitely better all around, has a better like perception with fans than Kushala. Kushala's legacy was probably too important to leave off the list. Mizutsune is such a really good Monster Hunter monster. In general, in its first appearance, was already really good. Probably still my third favorite of the Fated Four, but that's there's a lot of competition there. I think what really kind of pushed me to wanting Mizutsune in the top 12 was its appearance in Rise. Rise being so steeped in Japanese iconography and inspiration, it made so much sense for Mizutsune to be in that game. It fit perfectly. Its theme fit perfectly. It had a really good first impression in its own game, and then it comes over to Rise, and it felt like it was made for that game. I adore how Mizutsune works in Rise, and that was my big thing, is that he works so good in that game, fits that game so well. Violet Mizutsune comes out in Sunbreak and turns out to be one of the better fights that game has to offer. That game was so good to Mizutsune. And I wanted to keep the list interesting. I wanted to really kind of dig into some of the monsters that weren't obvious choices and see if they really had something to offer. And Mizutsune was one of them. It still kind of burns a little. I really wanted to get Mizu on the list, but I was convinced otherwise. And I'm not unhappy that Kushala managed to take 12. But if I got my way, Mizutsune probably would have been number 12, but I was convinced otherwise, and I conceded to that. Stinks though, because Mizu was really, really good in Rise. And the fourth generation flagship that is going to be on this list, that wasn't going to be in the top 12, tragically, was Bloodbath Diablos. If we were talking about just fights, Bloodbath would be on the list. Bloodbath just really doesn't have a ton of legacy yet, is definitely the issue. Bloodbath is one of the best Monster Hunter fights ever made. I fought him just like recently again with a couple of friends, and holy, that fight is really good. It's so good. The design is so good. The theme is amazing. The sound design for him is great. The lore behind him is really, really cool. His gear looks sick. I wanted Bloodbath on there. The thing that keeps him out is that the Deviants got mega shafted. I think the Deviants should be prevailing monsters. I think they need to make their way out of Generations. And then you take the Rampage Apex monsters, which are, for the most part, these watered down versions of the Deviants. They should have just been the Deviants. You know, if you wanted to say like, oh, these super powerful Deviant monsters got incited into doing what they were doing by Ibushi, that would have been so much better than the Rampage Apexes. I still have a bit of a grudge against them for what happened there. And you know what, if the actual Deviants were in Rise in the Rampage, and like Bloodbath was again at the helm of this group, now being spurned on by a Wind Elder Dragon, there would be an argument to make that Bloodbath would have made the top 12. But right now he's stuck only in Generations Ultimate with a not as good little brother in Rise, and a couple of his moves found his way onto the Diablos in that game, which is kind of cool actually. He has a little bit of legacy within like Diablos himself, which is neat. Bloodbath definitely needs to come back at some point. The Deviant should come back at some point. For such a great category of monsters with kind of a gimmick behind their getting their gear. If Bloodbath had shown up again, he might have made it. He might have knocked down a couple of monsters. Cause he's that good. He is that high quality of a fight. And the Deviant line in general is a very high quality line at its best. A couple of whatever entries on the Deviant line, but some of the Deviants are some of the best monster variations out there. I think Bloodbath definitely needs another shot. I think the Deviants need another shot. And if they got it in Rise and Sunbreak, he might have had it, but unfortunately just wasn't going to, which breaks my heart a little bit because I adore Bloodbath Diablos. Magnamalo is not in the top 12. I wonder if that surprised... I'm sure that surprised a couple of people, because I do like Magna. He's got a couple of haters out there. I know. I understand. I'm not one of you. but I get your point. I talked a lot about Magnamalo in the celebration of Rise and Sunbreak video and the issues that he has story-wise. I'm still confident in blaming COVID for some of the stuff that happened to that story and to Magna. He's not allowed to do much. He shows up once, you track him down, he has no presence within the rampage, which he is supposed to. There's not a lot of weight behind getting rid. He's just gotten rid of. Comes back in the All-Mother fight. That's kind of cool. He is, unlike, a Velkhana who dominates the second act of Iceborne. Magnamalo is present in Rise's story for about an hour. And that's pretty much it. And that stinks. That stinks for him. He is definitely a monster whose potential was completely squandered. For what he should have been able to do inside the Rampage, what he was supposed to kind of mean as this one singular entity who had no fear of the Storm Dragons, what he meant to the original Komorta village and the characters in there, and he's given nothing. All of these aspects of him and what he means to that game are never allowed to manifest. Thankfully, the Storm Serpents are allowed their bit of story, otherwise Rise's story as a whole would have flopped entirely. But yeah, Magna is definitely a victim of something, whether it was not understanding what he was able to do or time constraints, and I'm still willing to bank it on time constraints. Really good fight, very cool variation, pretty good gear, really good theme music. I don't hate the design. Definitely a little stylish, but I don't hate it. He's got a lot of good qualities, but yeah. And then, being in Rise, it's hard for him to get a prevailing legacy. That's a struggle that Malzeno has as well, but Malzeno is a monster who just kind of took the Monster Hunter world by storm completely and entirely when he came out, when Primordial came out. Magnamalo can't really boast that. Stinks. Kind of got done dirty. All right, so we're going to be moving into the non-mainline games now that, because Malzeno's on the list, as you would know by now. Espinas. Espinas was also pretty heavily considered for this. Unfortunately, he's kind of a thing with, kind of like Bloodbath, where it's just kind of too early. Espinas being the flagship of Frontier being a game that never came stateside, a lot of us never played. So as the flagship of his own game, doesn't leave a ton of impact on us because most of us haven't played Frontier. Frontier does have a massive legacy, both in of its own right and within mainline Monster Hunter. So Espinas being at the helm of that definitely gets a lot of props there, because Frontier has been very influential in Monster Hunter across the board. No matter how much you want to, no matter what you think of it, no matter how you look at it, very influential game. And being at the helm of that, Espinas gets a lot of credit there. Very good monster. It's, the fact that very few of us have played Frontier, not a lot of people really understood Frontier, myself included, for a very long time. I think it has a reputation that it doesn't deserve. But yeah, Frontier's a bit of a misunderstood game with misunderstood monsters. Its legacy, and thus Espinas' legacy as its flagship, can't be as strong as it maybe could have been. Espinas coming into Sunbreak was massive, and that was the big thing that really kind of bolstered his potential ability to be on the list, because of what he kind of means. He means that, Frontier coming into mainline is possible. Explore coming into mainline is possible. I'm not going to hold out hope for online because I think Tencent owns that game. I don't think that's going to happen, but the mainline Monster Hunter games could be thrown wide open with Espinas coming into Sunbreak. And not just him, but his subspecies showed up, Frontier skills showed up, Frontier developers came over onto the project, layered armor came over onto the project, monster attacks and weapon moves came over into Sunbreak. There's a lot of Frontier in that game, and it was predominantly for the better. It's a smidge too early. If this list was made when say like 6 and maybe like 6 Ultimate was out, whatever those games are eventually going to be. And those games had like 5, 6, 7 monsters from Frontier, 1 or 2 from Explore in there. Then we're really kind of talking about Espinas being in the top 12 properly, because then we know for a fact that the floodgates truly are open. We're still kind of operating on, at this moment as this video is being recorded, you know, in this little chunk of time, we're still kind of operating on the theory that the floodgates are open. You know, there's a lot of Frontier in Sunbreak, but the monsters are what really kind of legitimizes that thing, and we only have 2. We have Espinas and we have the subspecies. We have to see if more of these monsters actually show up. And if they do, you know, we're talking about Espinas maybe being in the top 12. Just because that impact on mainline is massive, massive, massive. There's a lot of really, really good Frontier monsters who deserve to be in mainline and who we might be seeing sometime soon. And that cannot be understated how cool that is. But again, that can only be hypothetical for now. But the potential is super duper cool. And then in of himself, the combat-wise, Espinas is a good fight. I think if we're looking at like Flying Wyverns, I think Seregios and Astalos do much more interesting things with being a Flying Wyvern. As I said when we were making this list, Espinas is kind of like what happens when you take Rathian and you take Diablos, you kind of match them together, and then you give him his own kind of flair. His elemental shenanigans are really, really cool. The Fire, Poison, Paralysis Fireballs, with the poison not lasting too long, which is kind of nice. So somehow they managed to like blend all of those things into one attack and not make it be like super duper frustrating or annoying. It actually works like really well. It makes him pretty menacing. And then Flaming Espinas is phenomenally well designed, but yeah, it's a little early. It's kind of like the Bloodbath problem. If Bloodbath was in more games, might have been on this list. If we knew for a fact that Espinas being in Sunbreak really does bring in this whole new perspective of Frontier being brought into the main line, of Explore brought into the main line, then we might have seen Espinas on this list, bumping down a couple of the other ones, but a little bit too early. And then there's just this kind of chunk at the bottom. I'm not going to break all these down individually. So again, like I said in the announcement, I wasn't going to cover every single monster from I wasn't going to look at every single monster from every update in Frontier, because they technically every update in Frontier has a flagship. I equivocate those to essentially being the same thing as title update monsters. Way too many. That would have just kind of bloated this whole honorable mentions thing entirely and just kind of filled up the tier list that we made with just a bunch of crap that was never, ever, ever going to get into the top 12. But I did want to look at Original Frontier, Frontier Forward, Frontier G, and Frontier Z, as those are pretty massive definitive overhauls of the MMO that really kind of set their own eras within Frontier and changed the games completely. They weren't going to make it into the top 12 just by proxy of not being in mainline games. You know, again, I'd say probably with Frontier, a good 75% of the Monster Hunter fan base, and now, especially now with like how Big World and Rise got, have probably never touched these guys, barely know who they are. It's a little too bad because, you know, if you watched the Frontier Part 1 and Part 2 videos I did, I have pretty high opinions of Rukadiora and Shantian especially. Great monsters, and probably some decent amount of impact within Frontier. I don't know like the nitty gritty of those games too well to really be able to comment on that, but I'm sure like they had a lot of good prevalence. And, you know, if they ever showed up, you know, Shantian having like multi-element facets and Rukadiora having magnetism they could potentially have some really cool impacts. Haven't seen a ton of that yet. You know, magnetism within Frontier from Rukadiora did have some prevailing legacy. Magnetism stuck around for a little while, found its way into a couple of monsters. You know, and then you have Zenith Espinas, which is just a Zenith species. I don't think he looks particularly great. He's kind of goofy looking, but the Zenith monsters are kind of cool. And then you got Nef, Garmot, and Australian from Online and Explore. Those are probably even less known than Frontier at this point. Australian even more so than Nefgarmat. Not a lot of people probably know what Monster Hunter Online is like at all. Again, cool monsters weren't gonna make this list. Maybe we'll see Nefgarmat someday. I don't know if we ever will with Australian. I think Online might be lost entirely. And then I don't even really know why I considered these guys, but they were flagships. I went back and forth on even like putting these guys in the list, in the running at all. Maybe they probably shouldn't have been, but I don't know. They were so you have Frontier and you have Online and you have Explorer, and they're like core flagships in Espinas, in Nefgarmat, in Australian, weren't in the games initially. So you have Teostra in Frontier, you have Rathian Online, and you have Flaming Rathalos in Explorer, who were kind of like the placeholder flagship monsters while these games were waiting for their core flagships to arrive. For like a little while, those three games were helmed by these three monsters who technically didn't helm them long term, which is interesting that like the core flagships of these three games, were not in these games at launch. These were the first to go. These were out immediately. They're there just for the fact that they technically led those games for like a little while, a couple months, and then got kicked to the curb. They're really only here on a technicality. And the other monsters that were kicked out were the flagships of some Monster Hunter games that just aren't conventional Monster Hunter games. So you have the story games, you have Feline Village or whatever the heck it's called, stuff like that. So there's like four Monster Hunter games that just, they are full-on spin-offs, right? They are different genres, they are different formats, they don't function the same. Wasn't even going to really entertain them because they just don't function the same way all these other monsters do. So they weren't going to make it on there either. So that is the honorable mentions for the top 12 flagships in Monster Hunter. That's why I'm sure some of yours favorites didn't make the list this year. I apologize if I made you upset, but there are reasons for the guys who didn't get on here for not getting on here. Couple of different circumstances here and there, things change around. Maybe there's a chance that some of these guys would have made the top 12, but as it stands, in what is currently late November, as this is being recorded in 2023, things are as they are, and maybe the future will change things around. Maybe this will be something to look back on and kind of reflect on and reassess in coming years, but for as we stand right now, these are the honorable mentions. A lot of really good monsters, a lot of decent flagships, with just like a couple of knocks here and there to knock them out of the top 12. Not to say anything negative about them specifically, but we had our reasons for not including some of them. So, hope you enjoyed this little intrusion into the Merry Huntmas festivities. Hope you enjoyed yourself here. Merry Huntmas 2023 will conclude tomorrow, Christmas Eve, with number 1. Not a lot of surprise left over who that is, but come on. You knew who it was going to be. Have a great holiday, and we'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye, guys.